Well, I think we could start. Martin, is it okay? You're good? Sounds good.
Just fine.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. Good afternoon. So I'll begin with a little bit of logistics. So as you may know, so the event is being translated, or the talk of Martin will be translated real time. So I'll be introducing our guest speaker in English, but for those who might want to listen to me in French, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see this interpretation kind of icon. So you can just click on it, and you can switch, so you can stay either in the room, so English room, so which is going to be the language that Martin is going to be using, and then you can click on French if you want to listen to me and to the speaker in French a little bit later. And then you have the off button. So if you go to French, then if you click on off, then you will just be hearing the French interpretation. If you don't click on off, then you will hear Martin Parker's voice in the background, and then the interpretation real time. So if you have any issues, just write to us in the chat, and probably Maxime will be helping you. So hello everyone, good afternoon. I'm Sofiane Baba, so a professor of strategic management at the University of Sherbrooke, and I was part of the small committee, organizing committee, along with my colleagues, so Anne-Marie Corriveau and Maxime Plante, and I must say that Maxime did most of the logistics work, so thanks to him. So welcome to all of you to this virtual conference on the challenges and the future of business schools. The conference is organized by le Centre Lemaire in Responsible Management, which is a research center based here at the Business School of the University of Sherbrooke. Maxime will tell you a little bit more about le Centre de Recherche Centre Lemaire. I'm personally very happy to see many of you attending this conference. I think it is a really important topic, especially when we consider the important role that business schools play in societies. And I would also like to thank Martin Parker for having so generously accepted our invitation. I think in about half a day, he had already responded to our invitation. So thank you very much, Martin. We know that you are really, really busy. So a quick bio. Most of you, a lot of you probably know Martin or have probably read some of his papers. So Martin Parker is professor of organization studies at the School of Management at the University of Bristol in the UK. He is also the lead for the Bristol Inclusive Economy Initiative and a distinguished fellow of the Schumacher Institute. He made headlines in the past couple of years with his call and his book called Shut Down the Business School, so published in 2018, and he will tell us a little bit more about the provocative title during his talk. In general, Martin Parker's writings seek to widen the scope of business and management studies, whether in terms of different sorts of organizations or different ways of representing what management is, what organizing can look like. The conference will last approximately 1 hour and a half, so 90 minutes. Our speaker will have about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A, so a discussion, open discussion for a similar amount of time, so about 40, 45 minutes. For the Q&A period, my colleague Anne-Marie will be in charge, so she will be handling any questions you might have using your microphone. And my colleague Maxime will be dealing with the chat. So if for whatever reason you cannot use your microphone or you wish not to do so, you can just type in your question, and Maxime will make sure to be reading it to our speaker. And once again, Martin, thank you very much. And thank you for being here. So the virtual floor is yours. So for about 40, 45 minutes, and looking forward to it.
Thank you very much indeed to all of you for inviting me. Thank you, Sofiane, for kind introduction, and for Maxime and Anne-Marie for doing the work to make this happen. So I'm gonna, as indicated, I'll talk for about 40 minutes now, something like that. And I've got a presentation that I'll be sharing. I just wanted to say a little bit about the sort of the context of this talk, really, because I do think, you know, given that I'm speaking in a different language in a different country, that it's important to kind of recognize the positionality of what I'm talking about here, and not assume a kind of universal experience. My background is in sociology, anthropology, and cultural studies. But for the last 25 years or so, I've been working in schools of management and business in the UK. But during that time, the higher education system in the United Kingdom has changed enormously. And it's part of that context, I think, that's important to recognize when I'm talking about this book, because when I was a student in the 1980s, I was part of a relatively small and almost entirely state-funded higher education system, in which a relatively small number of students went to fairly small few universities. Over the last 40 years, the UK higher education system has become a gigantic system with about 120 institutions, many of which are, you know, large, are kind of North American sized now, which was very unusual in this country, and which is almost entirely marketized, with, you know, very relatively high fee levels, and universities effectively operating in markets for research funding, for students, for conferences, for selling merchandise, all sorts of stuff. So the whole system has really been transformed. And I think that this book sort of reflects the Shutdown the Business School book that I'm talking about, kind of reflects the speed and violence of those changes. And I don't think they have happened in the same kind of way in most other countries in the world, apart possibly from Australia, where we've seen some similar kinds of changes happening quite rapidly. But that being said, I think that the experience of the UK, and particularly of the English Business School, is a kind of a message from the future, or rather a warning from the future, perhaps, because I do think that it seems to me that when I do these talks, that lots of people in lots of different countries, whether English speaking or not, recognize similar kinds of tendencies in the way that their higher education system is moving, and specifically in the way that their business schools are increasingly affecting the way in which their universities are operating. So I just want to say that to kind of acknowledge my positionality in a sense, yeah, and not assume that the Canadian or French Canadian experience is somehow the same as the UK experience. So let me start off with my presentation then. Sofiane, can you just tell me if you can see that okay?
It's perfect, Martin.
Okay. So, shut down the business schools towards a school for organization. So this is a kind of talk in two parts, really, in which the first part I'll be complaining about how terrible contemporary business schools are, except, of course, that the one at the University of Sherbrooke, which I'm sure is absolutely fantastic. And then I will be proposing an alternative way of thinking about education in organization and economy, which I call the School for Organization. Now, in developing my fairly crude and fast criticism of business schools, it's worth noting that there's nothing actually that new here. That, you know, in popular culture and popular understanding, globally, business schools are imagined often to be places where a particular kind of evil or stupidity or cruelty or selfishness is cultivated. That's a common notion. I remember having a painter in my house a couple of years ago, and I was trying to work, and he kept on coming in and having a chat. And one of the things, and when he found out I worked at a business school, he just kind of assumed that that was a place where people were taught to be unpleasant. You know, that's what business schools were for. They just make nasty people. Yeah, they make bosses. And this kind of, I've been tracing these sorts of ideas in popular culture for many years. This is Gunter, the moderately intelligent monkey, who from the Matt Groening show Futurama. Matt Groening was the same guy that did The Simpsons. And there's this great bit where at the end of the episode, Gunter, the moderately intelligent monkey, just decides that he wants to be a moderately intelligent monkey in a suit, so he goes to business school. Yeah, and the big gag is, of course, he becomes president of the Fox network, etc., which makes and distributes Futurama. So this idea of the MBA, of a particular sort of place where people are trained, is in popular cultural terms derided very often. So in a sense, what I guess I'm doing in this book and in quite a lot of my general moaning and complaints about business schools is no more than decorating popular cultural understanding. Yeah, and I'm in a sense taking an everyday understanding and trying to make it sound academically a bit more respectable. Now, the history of business schools, just very briefly, because I think it's kind of important to place this in a certain sort of context. Very often we're told that business schools were invented in North America, most specifically in the USA. This isn't the case. Business schools have their foundation in Northwestern Europe, particularly in some of the sort of industrializing towns and cities that were often sort of building a particular conception of a chamber of commerce, for example, of a kind of an interest group around a certain kind of managerial cadre, if you like. So very often, particularly in kind of French-speaking countries, you had this sort of idea of the Chamber of Commerce being attached to, often initially, a sort of an accounting school. Really, that was usually the first thing that was getting taught, was double entry bookkeeping and stuff like that. But fairly rapidly, it also becomes a bit more complicated. If you look at the histories of some of these places, so we take the École supérieure de commerce de Paris. That is a remarkably international place. There doesn't seem to be an enormous amount of writing on it in English. There might be a lot more in French, I don't know. But it sounds like it was a remarkably international place, relatively small by contemporary terms, but with a whole variety of different people from different European cultures and languages studying business together. Now, I don't know exactly what they were studying and so on, but most of these business schools are in advance of the American ones. And I think we can assume that there was a kind of a mishmash, primarily, again, probably about accounting, but early ways of thinking about, I don't know, marketing or operations or whatever else. Effectively, what happens in terms of the conventional story, though, is some Americans start the business school. Wharton is usually seen to be the first one, Harvard obviously the most famous one. And there's something quite interesting about the way in which the American business school emerges. It's almost always associated with some big university and so on. So not a freestanding institution in the way that we've seen in quite a lot of other countries in the world, but also often associated as it develops in the late 19th, early 20th century with a particular conception of what the sort of morality or ethics of business might be. So one of the things that we commonly see in this stuff is an attempt to kind of remoralize business at a time when business and government has an extremely bad reputation. If you think about the US of the late 19th, early 20th century, this is a place of enormous concentration of wealth. Talk about the robber barons and the huge levels of monopoly and oligopoly in terms of a series of key industries, the Gilded Age and so on, that then leads to the progressives and the depression and all the rest of it. So there's a particular context in which these business schools are kind of selling a certain sort of version of what the business person could, well, businessman, what the businessman of the time could be, and suggesting that this person could be a force for good, not simply a selfish, callous elitist, which after all was what many ordinary Americans would imagine that business people were.
Martin?
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting. I think there's just maybe your microphone is sometimes like touching or hitting your shirt when you turn around.
Oh,
there's like this noise that comes with it. It's nothing major, but yeah. All right. Thank you.
I'll try. Okay, I'll try and sit very still. I've got this. Sorry for the audience. I've got this strange problem at the moment in that there's something wrong with my headphones, So I'm speaking through the microphone. You probably see the headphones around my neck, speaking through the microphone, but listening to the audio through the computer. So I'll just try. So if I'm looking unnaturally still, it's because I'm trying not to touch the microphone. Sorry about that. Technology is great when it works, isn't it? Okay, so the situation now, just very briefly, there are between 13,000 and 15,000 business schools in the world. That in itself is an enormous number. It's difficult to get precise numbers on this. The 13,000 is a pretty good one. This is a AACSB guess, but quite a lot of people are citing a 15,000 figure for business schools from a couple of years ago. I can't source that. I can't find what it is, but it's a big number. And there are an awful lot of business schools charging an awful lot of money. About 1,000 of those schools are, fairly regular schools that are in various ways validated by different kinds of validating bodies like EQUIS and AACSB and so on. The average tuition fee multiplied by that 13,000 gives a fee income alone of about $400 billion for business schools globally, and that's probably a considerable underestimate. That's just the fee income from business schools. That's an extraordinary amount of money in itself, and it's not saying anything about the selling of textbooks or consultancy or gowns or merchandising or anything else. My point is, it's a very big industry. And at the top of this industry, there are some very high fees being charged. So London Business School, I think this figure is from a year or two ago now, charging nearly £80,000. So something like, what would that be? 110, 120,000 Canadian, something like that. I don't know how much, the elite business schools in Canada are charging. But this is an extremely lucrative part of the contemporary university. One of the important points to make in the English context here is that effectively the fee income from business schools, which is very often fee income based on teaching overseas students, often students particularly from China and from India, is effectively what has allowed the UK government to privatize the university sector. So, it's not too hyperbolic to say that without the business schools, the UK could not have moved to the market-based higher education system that it has now. Even a relatively new entrant like the University of Bristol has over 1,000 Chinese students, and all of those students would be paying about £25,000, so say about $40,000 Canadian for various courses in accounting, finance, and marketing, and so on. If you look at some of the bigger providers in the UK, they might have 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 Chinese students, again, all paying gigantic amounts of money to be studying in Sheffield and Manchester and London and so on. So this income stream has been absolutely vital to the UK higher education system. So I always like to put a small picture of my host institution. I couldn't work out from your website which building had the business school in. So I just picked a picture of what seemed to be a large pavilion on the central campus. Is this where the business school is by any chance, team?
No, not at all.
Is it
it's the library.
Oh, it's a library.
It's also the Chancellor's building, though.
Okay, well, I picked a reasonably interesting one. Most of the time, when you look at university business school websites, they always have a picture of a very shiny-looking building with lots of glass and a big atrium. And usually, it's quite fun just to show that. But obviously, on the University of Sherbrooke website, it doesn't have a picture of your shiny business school. So maybe you don't have a shiny business school building. So what do business schools do? This is a picture of the London Business School. For those of you who know London a bit, it overlooks Regent's Park in a very expensive area of West London, just near the zoo, in fact. What does this business school do? This would be regarded to be probably the premier business school in the UK and one of the leading ones in Europe. This is London Business School's pitch to you. And what's interesting about this, and you can pull out some paragraph from virtually every business school website that says something like this. What I wanted to point to really was the idea that this is almost always a pitch which is about the individual and their advancement. When I worked at the University of Warwick for a short while, I didn't really fit there terribly well, but Warwick is quite a corporate university in the UK. They had a very similar kind of idea about investing in you. So, you'd invest your fee in yourself, and the promise was that this investment was going to pay off in terms of presumably salary, career, put a Porsche on the drive by the time you're 25, that kind of thing. The point of these kinds of pitches is that they are primarily pitches which are about employability, about moving up within organizations, about fitting into contemporary understandings of what organized life might be. Now, this is the kind of cheekiest slide of all, because what I'm going to try and do, and apologies to everybody, because this is the one that offends people mostly. This is my my one-slide summary of the entire business school curriculum. Now, I should say, before I get virtual things thrown at me, this is what I think is a summary of 95% of the business schools in the world, 95% of the time. I'm not trying to suggest that it is the only thing that happens in all business schools. The very fact that I've been invited to speak at your place kind of indicates that you're interested in different ways of thinking about business and management. But most business schools, most of the time, I think, teach about these three core principles: corporations, growth, and management. So first of all, in terms of ideas about organization, the assumption is that the only interesting organization that's worth talking about is the corporation. That the corporation is, in a sense, the best, the most developed, the most advanced form of organizing. That it's the one that can best generate innovation and that can grow most effectively, that can satisfy customers and employ lots of employees and all the rest of it. It's assumed that it's almost like the kind of the shark of organizing or something. It's like the very best of those machines. And of course, as soon as we start talking about the corporation, not only are we talking about some gigantic poster kids, whether this is some big oil company or Facebook or whatever, but also about conceptions of shareholder value. Because it's effectively what the corporation does is to institutionalize and legalize the priority of shareholder value over other senses of value. So embedded in the celebration, the focus on the corporation, is a sense in which the only kinds of value that really matter are those which can be paid out in shareholder dividends. Other kinds of value exist, but they are, effectively, they're not as relevant as the bottom line. Secondly, ideas about growth. Growth is kind of assumed to be the necessary element of a necessary element of any successful business. Indeed, to define a business as being successful is to say that it grows, whether that's in terms of profitability or number of employees or number of shops or number of countries or whatever it might be. The assumption is that growth is the aim of any organization. Consequently, that big things are beautiful things, that the measure of the success of an organization is just how large it is. So consequently, there's a kind of reinforcing logic here, of course, isn't there? And that if we end up celebrating growth, then of course, we're going to be looking at corporations as our models of success, because they are precisely the big organizations that have usually benefited from growth, whether that's by organic growth or through acquisition. And then finally, these are organizations which celebrate management in quite a specific sense. Management in the sense of a particular cadre of people, the managers, who deploy a certain kind of expertise in order to manage large organizations. Effectively, what this does is to embed the idea that hierarchical forms of organization are inevitable within any large organizational form. In other words, that people can't manage themselves, that organizations can't be flat and self-managing. Management as both a description of a group of people and also as a particular kind of expertise embeds the idea that ordinary people can't manage themselves, that we're incapable of doing this stuff, and consequently that we need these people to manage us. We need this other cadre of individuals to manage us. Now, just to re-emphasize the point, I think other things are taught within some business schools, but 95% of the time, this is what the curriculum of the business school adds up to. It's based on these kinds of principles. It excludes other forms of organization. It denies the possibility of a steady state organization or economy. And so too does it deny the possibility that forms of self-management or cooperative or mutual forms of organization are reasonable or possible. So who's this curriculum for then? Well, I think it's basically for those who benefit from or want to benefit from the standard model of capitalism. So there's a simpler way in which we can talk about the business school. It's basically a place that teaches capitalism. It reproduces a particular set of assumptions that result in gigantic, eye-watering levels of global inequality. We now exist within a global distribution of wealth in which some of the people at the top of this list are wealthier than anybody on the planet has ever been, ever, in relative terms. This is teaching a particular kind of system in which in virtually every area of the economy, we see an increasing hegemony of a larger and larger, smaller and smaller number of organizations. This is a map of some food brands, for example. Most of these brands being owned by a smaller and smaller number of organizations. It's also celebrating an economic system that trades on externalities. Effectively, what capitalism has been doing and continues to do is to throw its rubbish over the wall on the assumption that it's somebody else's problem. Capitalism is an economic system that generates, whether it's human waste or non-human waste, as part of its structural function. And it operates effectively as if tidying up this stuff was not its problem. That's for the state to do. And finally, of course, climate change. Capitalism is directly implicated in climate change. Just to be absolutely clear, business emits carbon. Business that is producing the various forms of carbon emission that are currently characteristic of the global economy. So if we want to prevent species threatening climate change, we need to change business. But instead, what we appear to have is a set of 13,000 to 15,000 global institutions that are reproducing a set of assumptions about capitalism, which are precisely the problem in the first place. Now, I studied sociology in the 1970s, and one of the characteristics of that sociology was understanding Marxism, Marxist sociologies. I'm not sure if I'm a Marxist, I don't know. But I'm quite interested in this idea about ideology. If by ideology what we mean is a particular form of knowledge that normalizes, naturalizes the operations of power, then effectively what business schools are doing is ideology par excellence. They are generating a set of narratives, stories, pseudoscience, which justifies a particular kind of economic system, which is very good for those who benefit or want to benefit from global capitalism, but not quite so good for the rest of us, and indeed for the planet, so for them too in the long term. So business schools teach capitalism. Now, what do we do about that? You know, assuming you think that's a problem, we can certainly point to a variety of dissenting voices within the business school. As I indicated at the start, you know, I've been part of this broad movement for the last 25 years now called critical management studies. So a bunch of people like me who, you know, have backgrounds in sociology and anthropology and philosophy and various other things, who now occupy various positions within business schools in Northwest Europe and North America, and have been biting the hand that feeds them enthusiastically, using a whole variety of different sorts of theoretical resources, feminist, anarchist, green, post-colonial, socialist, and so on, in order to articulate their principled objection to the kind of research and teaching that conventionally goes on within business schools. Another part of this, I think, is also, though in a slightly more vanilla sense, the various ways in which people are talking about corporate social responsibility, diversity, sustainability, ethics, those kinds of sort of less, if you like, less directly critical terms, but certainly terms which are suggesting that there is some problem with the way in which global capitalism is operating. Now, you know, I've been very much part of this stuff. This is what, you know, I've imagined my political practice to be for many years. But of course, this is just a war of the pen. You know, I have written, I and many other people have written lots of excoriating, violently critical texts about business schools that make absolutely no difference at all. So, for example, I was given a job at the University of Bristol, which is, you know, fairly elite UK institution, despite the fact I'd written a book called Shut Down the Business School. Now, I assume that that doesn't mean somehow that the University of Bristol is a magnificently tolerant or indeed enthusiastic about dissent. Effectively, it means the book was irrelevant. That so much of this stuff, of critical management studies in general, has effectively been incorporated within the kind of the publishing discourse of the business school in general. To an extent that it doesn't seem to really matter what you write as long as it's published, because the contents are almost irrelevant. It's the fact of the publishing that seems to matter more. So, and this is where it gets better, okay? So depressing so far, but don't worry, I'm going to cheer you up in the last 10, 15 minutes. What do we do then? And the we I'm constructing here is a kind of an imaginary one. I'm hoping that lots of you in this audience would imagine yourself as part of that we. And consequently that your impatience, anger, despair at the way in which global capitalism currently operates results in you engaging in a whole variety of different forms of politics, whether that's taking to the streets or joining political parties or directing your consumption or your investment in particular kinds of directions, or just, you know, clicking a petition or two. The point is that very often what we do in terms of our activism, our organizing, is probably rather more relevant than the stuff that we write. I find it increasingly sad and a bit desperate, really, that people imagine that writing an article in a journal that nobody ever reads is a significant form of politics. And I guess I'm going to get some pushback from this, from that kind of statement in the questions. I hope so. But I kind of want to suggest that, you know, journal publication, I mean, okay, you could call it politics if you want to, but it's not particularly impactful, let's say. But as what's the usual cliche, you know, most journal articles aren't even read once, even by the reviewers. So here's the kind of the hinge, because it seems to me that rather than thinking about this term management all the time, what we should be doing is thinking about the term organizing. Organizing not being the same as management, organizing being a larger term than management. Organizing is a way of thinking about how people and things come together And organizing varies, as I suggested. When I was studying anthropology, for example, as an undergraduate, I was looking at a whole variety of different forms of organizing, whether we're talking about kinship systems or patterns of inheritance or myths or who you're allowed to have sex with or whatever. We're talking about different organizational contexts. So if we start off with this idea of organizing, we're inevitably into some conception of diverse forms of organizing, of a variety of different ways in which human beings can come together. Organizing, I'm defining here as the proper object of inquiry of a part of a university which is concerned with exchange relationships, the production of value, and the generation of organizations. So I want organizing to be the general term under which we can discuss how we come together with each other, human and non-human stuff, to do stuff. And this, it seems to me, is easy enough to justify in terms of common liberal notions of what the university might be. The most conceptions of what we usually call the sort of, I don't know, Humboldtian university or something like that, suggest that it has a series of departments that study certain kinds of topics. So a history department that studies the past, a geography department that studies space, a medical school that studies human bodies, and so on. And we kind of assume there's a sort of promise in that each of those areas would be relatively inclusive. I'm not saying there's no politics in that knowledge, of course there is. But could you imagine a history department that didn't teach about the 16th, 17th, and 20th century? Or a geography department that didn't teach about Canada? Or a medical school that only taught about some parts of the human body? Because effectively, I think that's what we've got with business schools, is a gigantic set of exclusions. In the 1960s, 1970s, a bunch of sociologists came up with this idea of the hidden curriculum, but basically saying what wasn't taught was as important as what was taught. And this was usually aimed at the politics of gender and later on the politics of ethnicity too. So in terms of the arguments about gender, if young girls weren't taught about women scientists or women who were involved in cultural production, or women who'd done brave and heroic things, then of course they would grow up with the idea that only men did this stuff. Yeah. So the hidden curriculum is basically a way of talking about what a discipline doesn't do, what it doesn't include. And it seems to me that the hidden curriculum of the business school is a yawning one, a gigantic one, in which a whole series of actually existing forms, different ways of thinking about ownership, control, exchange, carbon, mutuality, and so on, are simply ignored. They're not taught, or at least they're not taught routinely in 95% of the schools, 95% of the time. So if we take, for example, the cooperative form is not a new idea, the idea of a bunch of workers or consumers or producers who own their own means of production. There's nothing new about that. It's not particularly experimental. In the UK, we usually tell this story about British co-op being invented 200 years ago with the Rochdale pioneers. So, and there are now 7,000, I think, co-ops registered with Co-ops UK. But yet, if you went to most business schools in the UK, you wouldn't have any mention of co-ops. They wouldn't even cross people's radar. So this is the hidden curriculum, isn't it? This is all the stuff that business schools don't teach about. And this, I think, is a kind of betrayal of the idea of the university itself. It's a betrayal in the sense that the subject the business school teaches doesn't represent the diversity of forms that exist within that category. This is a quote I particularly like from my mother-in-law, gave me the Royal Horticultural Society's Gardener's Encyclopedia of Plants and Flowers. And it's a lovely, big, fat, illustrated book full of different kinds of plants, big plants and small plants, and plants that live in salty marshes, and plants that live in very dry areas or cold areas, or that have different kinds of flowers or means of reproduction and all the rest of it. Loads of different kinds of plants. The principle of this encyclopedia is basically how many different ways the world of plants has solved the environmental problems that it needs to deal with in order to thrive in environments right the way across the earth. So it's based on a principle of diversity, not a principle of uniformity. There are certain kinds of processes, biochemical, genetic, whatever, taking place behind that. But to document the variety of different ways in which the plants organize themselves, if you like, we need to assume that variety is the basis, not uniformity. Now, that is why I kind of push for this school for organizing idea, because I think that given the gigantic challenges that face us in terms of thinking about building an economy which is greener, more democratic, more equal, an economy which frankly we need in order to, as I said, save ourselves from a species threatening environmental crisis, we need to think about variety. We need to think about a kind of an experimental approach to organizing. To think about the diverse ways in which organizing can get done and has been done across history, across different sorts of cultures, different assumptions about who people are and what they do and what they can exchange and with who and who owns it, who controls it, and all the rest of it. We need to experiment with this stuff more now than ever. So teaching that global capitalism, a particular model of pro-growth managerialism, is the only solution is not only kind of politically bankrupt, it's also just practically bizarre, as if we were putting all our eggs in that one basket. We were assuming that that was the only way in which we could get through the crises that face us. Quite a few years ago now, in 2007, I, with some colleagues, put together a thing we called the Dictionary of Alternatives. And I suppose I was starting to get interested in these sorts of ideas then. And we started doing this book. And the idea was it was supposed to be a gigantic sort of compendium of different ways of thinking about organization. And it was going to have stuff about actually existing alternatives like co-ops and communes and mutuals and all that kind of stuff. But it was also going to have stuff about utopias and intentional communities and terrorist and criminal gangs and different ways in which work had been organized at different places and times and so on. And we wrote this gigantic book, which was, I think it was 250,000 words long. And then I sent it to the publishers, Z Books of London, and they said, this is too big. We can't publish it. There's too much of it. So I had to take it back and I had to cut out half of the book. And even after I'd cut out half the book, we still were left with this gigantic list of different ways and different authors and different ideas, which is a kind of shadow of what I wanted it to be, but still kind of represents something about the sheer complexity and variety of different ways in which human beings have thought about organization. And here somewhere, I don't know if you can see I know you can't at the moment, but about halfway down on the right-hand side in capital letters is the word management. Because I'm not saying that management isn't the form of organization too, but it's just one amongst lots and lots of others. But it's that one that's currently imagined to be the only important one, that's kind of pushed all the others out of the way. So in a sense, I suppose, this Dictionary of Alternatives thing, it's almost like a kind of, maybe you don't need to buy the book, you just need to look at the contents page, because that's the kind of demonstration that I want the School for Organizing to be, a demonstration that, yes, we can think about organization in terms of management, pro-growth, corporations, all the rest of it. But that's only one of the ways that we need to think about organization. And there are lots and lots of others. So the School for Organizing then, and I'll be taking applications for this at the end, because I'll have lots of really highly paid jobs. It will be a school that teaches about a low carbon economy, about localized supply chains, organizations that are collectively and democratic controlled, and a different kind of economy, an economy in which small is beautiful, and responsibility to people and planet is the means and end of business. School for organizing will be an experimental school in the sense that what it is aimed at doing is producing a generation of students who are properly and effectively equipped with knowledge about organization in order that they can think about applying that knowledge to the various issues and crises that they're going to face in their lifetimes, rather than simply reproducing market managerialism until we die. So organizing, and this is the final slide, organizing to me is a kind of politics made durable. It's a way of thinking about stabilizing certain kinds of relationships between human and non-human, and between different kinds of humans and their senses of entitlement or exchange or reciprocity, whatever. And if we define organization in that way, then the university, I think, gets a proper discipline, not just a finishing school for capitalism. That's why we should shut down the business school. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much. So I think Anne-Marie will be taking over.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Safian. Thank you, Martin, for this very honest reality check you've offered us this morning. Alors, pour la période de questions, on va alterner entre les questions au micro et les questions sur le chat. Alors, je vous demanderai pour les questions au micro d'ouvrir votre micro quand vous allez poser votre question et de ne pas oublier de l'éteindre par la suite. Comme on a une très belle audience ce midi, je vous inviterai aussi à essayer de limiter vos préambules au minimum de manière à pouvoir maximiser la période d'échange que nous avons avec Martin ce midi. Alors, sans plus tarder, à vous de prendre la parole. Je vois qu'il y a déjà plusieurs mains levées. Alors, on pourrait y aller avec la question de Monsieur Martin, Dominique.
Dominique, bonjour.
On ne vous entend pas, Dominique.
I think Dominic's having a bit of a thing.
Maybe Martin, you can help him out with your expertise on technology.
Certainly not. I think we better come back to Dominic.
Yeah, I think so.
You,
so we'll go with. Oh,
can you hear me? So I was just to say move to the next one, but I think it's working now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, so Sophie, I can hear you, Dominic. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much for the talk. I really enjoy it. I'm a professor of ethics at the School of Management Sciences at the University of Quebec at Montréal, and we have a research project right now. We're looking at the diversity of the forms of the firms. And one of the things that completely amazed me is that so I have more of a background in philosophy and political philosophy. And so in political philosophy or in politics or people that do political sciences have like thousands of proposals to reform democratic societies and institutions and ways in which they can be changed. And they're discussing about that all the time. And I'm always amazed to see that in like the more management literature, people never question like things like the ownership structure or the governance structure of the firm or the corporation. There are very few proposals that are made to reform the institution. And the idea also of the project we're doing right now is really to try to look in the literature in management or in governance to see if there are some proposals of reforms. And we're just at the beginning of that, but I just went.
You've just gone again.
On vous a perdu, Dominic.
Sorry, I got most of that, Dominic. Shall I try and respond? Yeah. So Dominic, I agree completely. I mean, it seems to me that large parts of the social sciences across the global north have been in various ways thinking about alternative imaginings for social, spatial, economic systems, and so on. It's only when you start to get closer to the business school or perhaps schools of economics as well, that effectively there's so little questioning, I think, of the ways in which the economy is currently imagined and forms of organization are currently imagined. And that really, I find profoundly depressing, because effectively what you get, I mean, you said that you were a professor of ethics, Dominic, is a kind of a sort of, I teach business ethics too, so I'm going to be rude about business ethics if that's okay. But it's a sort of collapse of the political into the ethical, which I've always found to be, I'm very interested in ethical theory, but the idea that ethics can somehow be a sufficient way of thinking about the politics of social systems is something that I've always found a bit difficult to imagine. But it's almost as if sometimes ethics is then used as a sort of a kind of a category that prevents us from thinking about political change, based on the idea that all we need to do is to change the ethics of senior managers and somehow capitalism will automatically become okay again. I'd love to talk to you more about this, Dominic, but basically I'll just agree.
Thank you. Maxime, est-ce qu'on a une question en ligne?
Oui, je la pose. The question is in English, so I suggest I will go in English, so there is no loss in translation. The question is from Martin Chadouin from UQAM. Martin says, some of my colleagues and I are trying to move the lines to bring in other elements, to do research differently on different objects, but the academic system of recruitment, evaluation, and valorization of research work is so focused on this idea of excellence, of publication in major journal, of quantitative data, etc. It is exhausting and difficult. You often feel alone. Any thought on that matter? What is your experience? And if I can add, do you think that the evaluation system of research is in cahoots with what you said about the business school? And
yes, I do. Thank you for translating that, and thank you very much for that question. I think absolutely that business schools, and certainly been my experience in the UK, that business schools are very often places with intense forms of focus on reputational rankings in ways that you don't quite see in other social science disciplines. My background discipline, sociology, for example, still doesn't have a kind of an authoritative list of journals or something. It doesn't have the sort of the FT45 list of journals, whatever it might be. So there is something particularly dispiriting, I suppose, about the ways in which academic labor is imagined to take place within the business school. And that many of the kind of machineries that you've just described seem to me to be ways in which more radical and challenging forms of thought are effectively filtered out. I sometimes use this metaphor of a rock tumbler. So, if you've got if you want to take a pebble from the beach, and you can put it in a kind of a thing called a tumbler, which just rotates, and you put some sand in and so on, and it eventually, when the stone comes out, it will be beautiful and all its sharp edges will have been taken off. And I often think that that's what journals do. They get a particular kind of often quite sort of spiky and difficult set of ideas, and then they tumble them around in the system of refereeing, rankings, and all the rest of it. And the final thing that gets published is kind of smooth and beautiful, but also has had all its politics taken away from it. Well, not all of it, but has been kind of depoliticized in a sense. So we could almost imagine journals and ranking systems and CVs and all the rest of it as kind of anti-politics machines, ways of making sure that thought becomes vanilla, becomes domesticated, fits into the boxes that are provided for it. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen in other disciplines too. I think it does, but the business school seems to be a particularly intense application of that kind of process, such that, you know, recently at the University of Bristol, we were having some kind of rather angry discussion about whether books should be published or not, you know, or whether a book was really an appropriate form of publication for a business school academic. You know, I don't even understand why that's a question. Why would we discuss this? You know, it's as if the book was some kind of strange new invention that we should be questioning. Quite bizarre, quite bizarre. So yes, basically, again, I find myself agreeing with the question. Thank you, Maxime.
Next question, Madame Émilie Blandine Emilien.
Hi, Martin.
Yeah. Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, hello.
Hi there. I'm an alumni of the DC's Critical School of Management in Leicester, so that's where we met. And I'm now a professor, and I'm Dominic's and Martin's colleagues at the University du Québec à Montréal. So I'm a
congratulations, Emilien.
Thanks. It's good to see you and you and you. And precisely, I kind of wanted to hear you a little bit about our DC's School of Management. How do we? There's an expression in French saying that we are sometimes cordonniers mal chaussés, so cobblers with the wrong shoes. How do we move from a school of management to a business school? So what is it that we're not doing well in organization, in-house, prior to being able to advocate teaching what we want to teach now, which is what you've just talked about and advocated for? Because I'm now in a school of management and sciences of management, and I've always be afraid of losing that label and turning ourselves at UQAM into a business school. So I wanted to hear you a little bit about this transition that you that our colleagues went through. Thank you.
Sure. Can I just sort of take that in two parts, Emiliana? And really good to see you again. That I should say a little bit about the University of Leicester school. So we both worked there for a while. The University of Leicester had a pretty big concentration of critical management people. Some really important scholars there. The first head was Gibson Burrell, who's very well-known organization theorist. And over the period that I was there, we did some extraordinary stuff, I think, and really, so a fantastic PhD program, some really interesting publications and conferences and teaching and all sorts of stuff like that. After about I think 13 years, so by 2016, the university was starting to get very impatient with the school. There'd been common stories about this idea that the school wasn't making as much money as it might do because it was, a bunch of postmodernists and Marxists and anarchists and feminists and all that kind of stuff. People like Camilla. And then we effectively what happened was that they kind of closed some of this stuff down. And then in 2021, there was basically a concerted attempt just to sack people for writing in the wrong kind of journals. And so 16 of our colleagues, ex-colleagues, were then sacked, made redundant, not because their courses didn't exist anymore or because there was any suggestion that they weren't teaching adequately or that they weren't publishing, but simply because they were publishing critical materials. And that was the first time, I think, in the UK that we've seen such a huge censorship of academic opinion. If you want to know more about that, Google the University of Leicester School of Management. The other thing that you were raising, Blondine, there was this sort of idea that there's something of a philosophical difference between a school of business and a school of management. And I think, yes, that there very often is. I'm not quite sure that we sometimes get a bit distracted by those terms, though, because in a sense, and I'm a bit puzzled by this myself, I'm not hostile to the idea of schools teaching business. We're going to need business. The question is what kind of business, isn't it? So if we're teaching about cooperative business or mutual business or green business or whatever, then I'm pretty happy. And in a sense, I don't really want schools that are just, teaching management as if management were a special kind of knowledge taught to special kind of people, all that kind of stuff. So I'd kind of like to reverse it in a way, although I recognize, of course, that in the UK, I don't know whether it's the place in all sorts of other cases, other countries, that there's that sense that business schools are somehow more corporate or more captured or something, while schools of management are more academic, something like that. Yeah. But do, for those of you who don't know about it, do Google about the University of Leicester case, because it's quite astonishing, really, in terms of a mature academic system like the UK effectively sacking people in almost McCarthyite ways for simply where they wrote. And ironically, a journal that I used to edit and books that I've written were used as evidence in sacking people. In other words, if I hadn't have left, I'm sure I'd have been sacked too. But people were using the fact that they'd kind of associated with Martin Parker as evidence of why they should be sacked. You can see why that might make me quite angry. Thank you for the question, Blondine.
Thank you.
And thanks for the answer. Maxime, other question from the chat?
I have this one is more like it's more a comment, but I really think the argument behind the comment can be turned into a question, and which is worth to address. It goes as follows. In the medical field, it would seem to me that most people wish in the end to specialize in one body part rather to be a general practitioner. I guess in economic terms, one does not have much leeway other than ensuring that there is post-diploma comparative advantage to survive in the labor market. What do you think that there is indeed not really much leeway other than going on the side of specialization?
Yeah, I guess that I would need to talk to the person who pitched that question about what they thought the role of universities was. So the assumption that universities are directly and tightly tied to labor markets is certainly a very common one now across the global north and more widely. I don't think that necessarily exhausts the kind of things that we might describe universities doing. After all, if that were the case, if universities were simply about teaching people to get jobs, then why would we do any kind of new research at all? Why would we have philosophy? Why would we have any forms of teaching or training that had nothing directly to do with labor markets? Now, I kind of assume that the last 800 years of universities globally has been about a bit more than just teaching people for jobs, to do particular kind of jobs. And I would also assume that particularly in the kind of, if you like, the sort of 20th century, well, mid-20th century conception of the university as a particular lighthouse for certain kinds of argument and debate and ideas, that there's something in that we would want to preserve. And that, I think, necessarily means that universities must at least be partially detached from labor markets, which isn't to say they shouldn't be, to some extent training people for different kinds of professions. Of course, I understand that. I'm not suggesting they should float entirely free of their context, but at the same time, there needs to be something of a gap between thought and job in order to justify the idea of the university at all. Otherwise, as I said, we might as well just hand out qualifications and stop doing research. There's no functional reason for us to do anything else. So if that was what was behind the question, then I would want to enlarge the conception of what the university could be in fairly, typical liberal democratic ways.
Thank you. Madame Rachida, une question?
Bonjour, Rachida.
Hey, bonjour. Thank you very much, Professor Parker, to be with us today. My question is basically business schools are part of a political environment globalization mindset. So
Je m'excuse, Rachida, on vous entend très mal.
as long as
Rachida, you might want to try with your camera.
dollar metrics. It would be
Rachida, je m'excuse, Rachida. Rachida,
Can't really hear.
on vous entend très mal. Il semble y avoir un problème de réseau. Est-ce que c'est possible peut-être d'éteindre la caméra et de recommencer votre question? Je pense qu'on va revenir à Rachida. Est-ce que vous êtes toujours là? On va lui donner une chance. On va revenir à Rachida un peu plus tard. Maxime, je pense qu'il y a d'autres questions sur le chat.
A question is kind of in the same direction than the last one from Amélie. There have been much debate about undergraduate students' lack of receptivity to challenging ideas these past few years in Quebec. Is it too late for many students choosing to attend the business school to start teaching them that there are alternatives to capitalism? How do you jumpstart change when many students actually pick business school because they know and accept they will learn about capitalism?
I think that's a really important question, and one that puzzles an old man like me. I'm very reluctant to blame students. It's easy enough for elderly academics with idealistic conceptions of universities to blame young people for not agreeing with those notions. So I think it's our responsibility to sell a different version of business school education. But in my experience, it's not that hard. So one of the things I've been doing for the last 2 decades really is taking students who have come to study business and management and trying to help them to understand what they do about the crises in the world that they live in. And remember, these are young people who know about the climate crisis. They've been taught about this since their primary schools, their kindergartens. They know about homelessness and inequality. They know that corporations routinely lie to them, that they buy products that are made in sweatshop conditions in other parts of the world. They understand the problems that exist within global capitalism. They're not naive about this stuff. What they don't do, or what they don't understand, I think, is what they can do about it. Because when they're confronted with this gigantic systemic edifice of capitalism, I don't think that they very often have the resources or knowledge to think about how system change might take place. So it seems to me that's our job then, isn't it? That's exactly what we should be giving them, rather than complaining about the fact that somehow they're too selfish or utilitarian, or that they just want to get jobs or something. Is to teach them that it's possible to imagine a different way of being human together, which isn't just about mobile phones and cars or something. Now, in a lot of the teaching I've been doing, and this is again not a new insight, you start where the students are, right? You begin with their understandings, and they, in say the University of Bristol, they walked over some homeless guy on the way to the lecture theatre. They've seen the houses of the wealthy and the tower blocks of the poor in the distance. They know that the University of Bristol lies to them routinely. This is not news to them. So what I try to do is to take those understandings and then talk about what we can do about them. To not to preach, but to try and give them tools. So we can all do that in our classrooms. I don't think that's a big ask really, but certainly not start by blaming students.
I think Rachida is back. If you want to get back at your question, please.
Welcome back, Rachida.
I'm sorry, I was kicked out
from
the system. So it's all about the system thinking. as business schools are not from anywhere. They are part of the mindset, the globalization, and also because you talked about the performance previously. So metrics. Metrics are we are used to are related to dollar, the signs of the dollar sign. So how can we do it differently while being part of the system?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a bit like the kind of the question for the students, isn't it? You know, so that when they're confronted with the structures of their experience, they can't imagine how the world could possibly change, could be different. But of course, we know that systems change. You know, that's a description of history, isn't it? That a whole series of assumptions that we make about people and exchange and institutions and countries alter throughout history. So I think what we need to be able to do with ourselves is to see past the current ways in which we are structured by systems and understand that these systems can change. It's not going to be easy. It's never going to be easy to, you know, get past the hegemony of ranking systems or the demand from universities that their business schools make gigantic sums of money and so on. There's a whole series of reasons why it's going to be difficult, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and do it, that we shouldn't try and push in those kinds of directions. And indeed, I think some of it is no more than taking permission to do stuff. So going back to, you know, what we do in classrooms or what we write or something, then that's up to us. You know, there's a sense in which, of course, it's difficult, and I understand that it's much easier for, you know, established old professors like me to do this kind of stuff than it is for junior staff. But at the same time, I sometimes worry that people find it a bit too easy to excuse themselves and blame a system, to almost kind of, I suppose there's kind of an existential point here, isn't it? It's easy enough to say that I can't do something different in my classroom, in my writing, in my practice, whatever, in my activism, because of this. Well, you know, yes, you can. I think you can. You can make those kinds of decisions yourselves in small ways, you know, in terms of how you build your classes, for example, yeah, the kinds of examples that you teach. So yes, I do think we can change things. Well, not always. I mean, sometimes I get very depressed about the world too, but most of the time I am ridiculously optimistic.
Thank you.
Maxime, est-ce qu'on a une question de ton côté?
Yes, I have one from Jean-François Lalonde, and this one might appeal to your Marxist side.
Okay.
There were times in history where when intellectuals came from different disciplines came together in an effort to high interdisciplinary and political activism and participation. Do we need a new crisis like the French Revolution to achieve this high level of political activism, collaboration, and eventually social change?
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? I guess, I mean, you know, I think in general terms that crisis usually stimulates imagination and change. So yes, I'd kind of agree with that in general terms. It seems to me that there are some quite specific things about the shape of universities in the global north now that we need to change as well. So one of the things I was thinking as soon as you started reading that question, Maxime, was the ways in which the business school is very often, you know, it is a separate building. I mean, I was making that joke about trying to find the picture of your building. You know, most universities have separate shiny buildings for business schools. In fact, universities are very often structured with separate disciplines in separate places, different kinds of students going to different places to be taught by different kinds of specialists about certain sorts of things. And in lots of UK universities, like lots of universities globally that I've visited, the business school is sort of, you know, it's a separate part of campus. It's, you know, it often faces a different way. It's shinier and nicer, has different kinds of staff, and is often quite alien to a whole bunch of people from the arts, humanities, well, from any other discipline. who imagine what goes on in this mysterious business school, but don't really connect to it, relate to it in a way. Now, in that sense, I think that the business school needs to be bulldozed, in part so that its questions can be distributed to the rest of the university. Because the question of the business school, how do we live well? How do we produce an economy which is low carbon, high inclusion, high democracy? Are questions that are not simply questions that can be settled in that shiny building. And of course we want historians and psychologists and engineers and whoever, I don't know, whoever else wants to come and play involved with that kind of stuff. But I know from my own experience that very often people from other disciplines don't want to get involved with the business school because, you know, it's a bit cheap there, isn't it? And they're all a bit, you know, they're all rather well paid, and the students are all a bit selfish, and, you know, there's a whole set of ideas about. I remember years ago when I worked at Warwick and I was doing some work on a philosophy of social science module. I had to meet a bunch of people who were teaching from the sociology department. So we met in this cafe, and after we'd met, then one of the guys sort of turned to me and said, "You're not too bad, really, are you?" Because he'd already decided that some shiny shit in a suit was going to turn up, and he was going to have to make his excuses and disappear. You know, he'd already decided the business school wasn't going to be somewhere he was going to find anyone interesting to talk to. So he was quite surprised when I turned up, and I managed to convince him I wasn't too bad. So I would almost, you know, kind of, I mean, yes, no problem with crisis in terms of the question, but, you know, let's re-engineer the university as well and make, as I said, the business school's questions into a much more general way of thinking about how the university articulates itself.
These kind of things still happen today, Martin. The situation you described happened to me just before COVID with some professors and another faculty. We have another question from Madame Valérie Michaud.
Bonjour, Valérie.
Bonjour. Hi, thank you so much for this inspiring presentation. It resonates so much, you have no idea. So thank you very much. I'd like to ask you about your experience in terms of challenging and transforming, in terms of what's the best strategy to organize ourselves and transform business schools. Indeed, myself, I have the luxury. I'm at UQAM and I've been hired as a social economy professor. So that's the luxury I have. That I'm teaching actually co-op businesses and alternative organizing. So that's one part of my job. But I've been thinking a lot about in order to hijack a plane, you have to step in. And in order to do that in a business school, then you have to teach mainstream as well. So I'm kind of always juggling with these two perspectives of either I'm teaching specialized, very highly interested students in my field, and that's perfect and fine, but also transforming and, like, you know, getting into mainstream courses and injecting some social economy, alternative organizing in there. And I believe you might have more experience than I do in terms of reflecting on what's most effective in terms of research, teaching agenda to transform our business schools.
I'm sure that your experience and skill is every bit better than mine. I just to reflect on some teaching I was doing last week, perhaps. So I teach on a course on business ethics and sustainability, and I started off, and these are kind of students who are interested in ethics, I suppose, and broadly interested in kind of green stuff in general. But I started off talking about corporate social responsibility and purpose-led organizations. And they were nodding enthusiastically, of course, about, you know, the idea of Unilever being a purpose-led corporation and those kinds of things. And then I asked them whether they believe corporations, whether they trust them. And of course, most of them say that they don't really. You know, and I used a couple of examples of corporate social responsibility stuff, and we talked about trust. And then I tried to talk a little bit about some local. And like Quebec, Bristol has an awful lot of interesting co-ops and and different sort of social economy forms. So I talked about some local businesses, including some cafes just down the road from the university, and asked them whether they trusted those organizations, and they felt they did. They felt that they were sort of smaller and more human. And when we looked at their websites and they thought about their involvements with those organizations, that somehow they were more trustworthy. And then I started talking about the fact that the organizations they trusted more were a co-op, an employee ownership trust, and a B Corp. Yeah. So that in a sense I could kind of move them from a discussion of purpose-led CSR to, okay, so let's look at some organizations that really do pay this stuff out then. Yeah. And not in a way of saying that these organizations are perfect, because there's going to be problems with any form of organizing. But I think I got them interested in the idea that if you really do want to be serious about thinking about a more inclusive, greener, more democratic economy, then you need to think about ownership and control. It's not enough just to trust some big corporation that tells you that now it's decided it's purpose-led. Did that help?
Yes, I'm still divided on the issue. I still think I have to step in on both roads in order to try. Yeah. But I think we also have to think of our research agendas as well. This resonates as well as getting involved into the organization, taking more action research postures in terms of methods, and I think that there's so much to do. I don't know where to start, but that's still any inspiration is great at this point. So thank you very much.
Yeah, is UQAM in Montreal?
Yeah, it is.
Yes, Montreal. I thought it was. So, I mean, Montreal has an awful lot of really interesting co-ops and stuff, doesn't it? Probably just like Bristol. So, I mean, one of the things I did on this course also was to bring in somebody who's involved in a big sort of redesigning the food system project, and is involved with all sorts of interesting co-ops and stuff. So we can talk about some very local, very concrete things. And I guess, in the same way in Montreal, you can probably bring in local activists or business owners and so on. And they have a sort of whiff of reality about them that's so much better, that really sells it in ways that we can't, because these are people who are actually doing this stuff. So, I mean, I used to have this idea of kind of letting the city teach, rather
I have what I call living cases that I bring in.
Yes, absolutely. Because they kind of do the work for us in a sense, don't they?
Well, thank you.
But I'm very jealous that you're a social economy prof.
We're 5 actually at UQAM. Wow, and in our department.
Any jobs at UQAM?
Well, look up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Merci.
Time is flying. It's almost up. Maybe just before you leave us, Martin, I'd like to know if there's hope. Do you feel that your critical view is shared amongst academics in UK and maybe in some other parts of the world? Do you feel there's enough people that are going to move that way of transforming and making more actual the business schools?
I don't know. I'm sighing, aren't I, as I think about it. I was in a meeting yesterday. I sit on the board of a local organization called the Green Capital Partnership, which is 1,000 local Bristol businesses committed to zero. And it's a really inspiring bunch of people. And we'd been through a kind of an exercise where we were talking about values and strategy and various other bits. And one of the things that came out of the value piece was this idea of holding hope and anxiety as values in tension in the way that we thought. And it was only this time yesterday I was thinking about this, and it kind of struck me that there's something quite interesting about that honoring of the fear, rage, desperation, impotence that so many of us feel with the news on TV right now. Because to simply say that you hope is like, fairy dust stuff, isn't it? You might as well just be watching a Disney cartoon or something. So in order to be realistic about that hope, you also need to say something about fear and rage that energizes that hope, that makes it meaningful. Otherwise, I just end up responding, Anne-Marie, yes, I'm hopeful. And, you know, so what? That's kind of not relevant in a sense, is it? Because most of us, I think, are hopeful in the sense that we would like to imagine that this conjunction can change. But at the same time, there's going to be an awful lot of anger and desperation. Rage is the Extinction Rebellion version of this, that's going to need to propel this hope. Yeah. Otherwise, I just come across like some kind of naive hippie, yeah, who just wants a world in which we can all ride dolphins. Yeah, that's not really going to help get through some of the really chewy political problems that we face right now.
In some way, it's a call for action.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
A call
but
for action.
Maybe just taking the time to discuss this kind of matters together is a first step in a good direction. Meeting with people that share the same same questions. Well, thank you so much, Martin, for being with us today. It's been very inspiring, even though maybe a bit shocking for us. Before we leave, I leave to Maxime the last word of the day. And thanks again, Martin.
Thank you very much for inviting me, all, and thanks ever so much for the really excellent questions as well. Hope to meet some of you in person one day.
Martin, I'm going to do the last bit in French, so I don't know if you want to join on the French channel. It's up to you. Yeah. Pour ceux qui ne me connaissent pas, je m'appelle Maxime Plante, je suis coordonnateur du Centre Lemaire en gestion responsable. Merci tout d'abord à tous ceux et celles qui ont pris le temps de poser des questions, à tous ceux et celles qui ont assisté. Merci pour les échanges stimulants. Comme Anne-Marie venait de le dire, je crois que c'était important de se donner des moments de réflexion collectifs de manière explicite pour réfléchir sur notre rôle, sur notre impact et sur notre avenir comme institution d'enseignement. Je voudrais aussi remercier Denise et Jessica d'Athénao qui ont assuré le service d'interprétation. Merci beaucoup de faire le pont comme ça nous a beaucoup aidé, on l'apprécie énormément. Puis je voudrais surtout remercier notre conférencier chaleureusement, Martin Parker, pour sa générosité, pour l'enthousiasme aussi avec lequel il a accepté notre invitation. On était vraiment ravis. Et le remercier d'avoir partagé avec nous son regard sans complaisance, franc, sur l'avenir des écoles de gestion, mais aussi sa vision qui, elle, est effectivement pleine d'espoir, je pense, sur ce qu'il appelle l'école de l'organisation, qui est vraiment inspirant. Je pense que vous en serez d'accord avec moi. Un dernier mot en terminant pour vous dire que le cycle des grandes conférences du Centre Lemaire s'inscrit dans notre programmation d'activités de notre centre de recherche, dont le mandat est de promouvoir et de valoriser les pratiques de gestion responsable, en animant la discussion sur différents thèmes, des thèmes transversaux comme l'avenir des écoles de gestion aujourd'hui, mais aussi sur des thèmes plus spécialisés comme la finance responsable, la santé organisationnelle, pour ne donner que ces deux exemples. Je vous invite à demeurer à l'affût de notre programmation, des prochaines activités qui s'en viennent, en vous inscrivant.
Oh, your microphone, Maxime. You muted yourself.
Pardon, j'ai fait une fausse manipulation. Je disais donc que si vous voulez demeurer à l'affût, j'ai mis le lien dans le chat pour vous inscrire à notre liste de diffusion sur notre site web, tout en bas. Vous pouvez aussi nous suivre sur le réseau LinkedIn. Donc, je vous remercie encore énormément. Merci beaucoup, Martin, également, pour votre participation à tous, pour votre implication et pour vos questions. Puis, je vous dis à la prochaine fois.
Au revoir. Merci à tous.